begin with a prayer. We always begin our events in class or here in Sancta Maria Hall with a prayer, and very often, most often, a prayer to Our Lady, because we entrust all of our work here to Our Lady, her intercession and her care. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Good evening to one and all. Good evening, Archbishop Cordileone. On behalf of the faculty, the staff, the seminarians of St. Patrick's Seminary, I'd like to welcome all of you here to the seminary for this wonderful conference. It's sure to be a wonderful few days together. My name is Father Mark Doherty. I'm the president-rector of the seminary, and take a lot of pride in what we're building here, what we're doing here these days, the project of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music at St. Patrick's Seminary, founded and run by Dr. Jenny Donaldson-Novitska. A lot of wonderful stuff, and so it's a great privilege for us to welcome you and host this conference. The seminary, some of you may know, dates back to the 19th century, 1898, opened its doors under the care of the Sulpician Fathers, who ran the seminary up until 2017. Today we have men from about 12 sending dioceses, started the year with 78 guys, 12 dioceses and a couple sending congregations, mostly from the West Coast and the Pacific Rim. A lot of wonderful stuff going on here. Among other things, the establishment of the Catholic Institute for Sacred Music. We're in the midst of a chapel renovation project. Some of you have been tracking over the course of the past couple of years, and many other wonderful things. So we're very glad to have you. We hope you have a wonderful couple of days. If you need anything, the seminarians are incredibly gracious individuals. They're very welcoming and hospitable. Please don't hesitate to flag one or another down if you get lost in the square hallways or forget where the refectory is or what have you. But we're very, very glad to have you. Without further ado, it's my pleasure, my privilege to invite up to the podium my colleague and my friend, the foundress of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, and so many other wonderful things we're doing here, Dr. Jenny Donaldson-Novitska.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's really a privilege to have people from so many parts of the world and so many different aspects of Bill's legacy and life here. And I'm really so grateful that you're here to pray with us, to think with us, to listen, and to dine with us. Little logistical thing, after this talk, there will be a reception to which you are all cordially invited. We have a wonderful chef on campus, and he's prepared a lovely reception for us. And that is, if you go out these doors to the left and then take another left through the large white carriage doors, you'll see another building back there, and that's the refectory. And you will see some lights on and smell some lovely, delicious food. And please come and join and celebrate with us over there this evening. The splendor of the truth is made manifest, indeed given flesh, in acts of heroic virtue, a life of apparent holiness, and through radiant beauty. All these things are friends, and all of them are necessary in our time to draw souls to Christ. Among these friends which make God known, it is especially the radiant beauty of the Church's treasury of sacred music that draws us here together today. This beauty that enraptures us and draws us into the heart of the mysteries celebrated in the most sacred liturgy has its source in Christ's incarnation, the Word made flesh to dwell among us. A moving testament to this beauty is the unaffected, straightforward, and persevering manner of Dr. William Mart that has drawn so many here to this conference to celebrate his life and work. Dr. Mart's work has been, for so many, a compelling witness to the beauty of Christ, the cosmic harmonia ordered by the Logos, the Word of God, and made audible to us through the Church's Gregorian chant, her sacred polyphonic tradition, and the fitting commentary on the liturgy provided by the thunderous, the whispering, and the lyrical sounds of the organ. It is this splendor of truth that is particularly evident in the scholarship of Dr. Mart, and it animates the habitus of mind, which he has inculcated in countless students in his decades of teaching at Stanford, at the CMAA Colloquium, in the St. Anne Choir, and elsewhere. The model provided by Dr. Mart is one which takes seriously the greatest heights and most profound depths of the love of God poured out in the sacred liturgy as we do this in memory of him. Indeed, Dr. Mart has demonstrated that a model scholarship is one which takes seriously the nature of reality as ordered by God, as well as the continued working of God in the sacraments, in the graces given to us through the material world. It is this model that can truly enter into the seriousness of the delight, of the playfulness of the material world in these mysteries. And this delight is audible to us in a most profound way in the Church's sacred music. There are many groups that are represented here today that have made this conference possible. Dr. Mart has served for almost 2 decades as the president of the Church Music Association of America and the editor of its journal, Sacred Music. The CMAA is wonderfully represented here in the behind-the-scenes work and musicians leading the liturgies of the conference. The St. Anne Choir, too, which he has directed for 60 years, forms the core of our singing ensemble for the liturgies for the conference, and does so with an enthusiasm and profound love for the dedicated service and life of Dr. Mart. Stanford University's music department has underwritten our lecture tonight as part of its Alexander Memorial Lectures, and the Benedict XVI Institute has also helped out in spreading this evening's events open to the public. I'm very happy also to continue to share with you the privilege that St. Patrick's Seminary has had in naming an endowed chair to honor Dr. Mart's lifetime of service to the Church's Treasury of Sacred Music. Dr. Mart has been a part of the faculty of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, a guest speaker here in our public lecture and concert series, and frequently seen friend at seminary events. I'm delighted you've come here to join us for what promises to be a fitting celebration for a man who serves the truth in charity, witnessing to the beauty where God is made known. It's also my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Kerry McCarthy, a student of Dr. Mart's at Stanford. Today it was my privilege to meet her in person for the first time, but I'm so grateful for her continued presence to me and others from afar through her wonderful, wonderful scholarship, especially on Tallis and Bird, as well as her very winsome way of presenting this beautiful music to us. I am confident we will learn much from her this evening as she helps us enter into a topic about which she is writing her next book. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a real privilege to be here at this conference in honor of Bill. We've all learned so much from him. We've learned from his teaching and from his practice, and also from his example. We've learned what it looks like to have a real lifetime commitment to this music. So before I say anything else, I want to say the most important thing, which is to Bill. Thank you. Thank you. I was singing one day at the Dominican church in Portland, and the priest told a little story to the congregation. He said, well, I was talking with the chant scholar, Dr. William Mart, and I said to Dr. Mart, music is so important. You know, they say that music is the second homily. And Dr. Mart said, no, it's the first homily. Now, our Dominican friend very generously told this story on himself. Music isn't even the second preaching, it's the first preaching. So with that in mind, I'm very reluctant to take up 45 minutes of everyone's time right now with talking, when that could be 45 more minutes of singing instead. But there is always something to be said about singing, and it's great to be here with such a lovely audience in honor of what Bill does and who he is. My topic today is a fairly simple one, but it's something that seems to keep coming up when you look at early English music. And the topic is low style and high style. I'd like to start by reading you a bit of musical criticism. This is somebody writing about what you could call high style. He's writing about complex polyphonic music in England right before the Reformation, the really big and flamboyant and sonorous stuff. Just 3 sentences. I'm going to quote them to you now. In the end, the music of Fairfax Shepherd and John Taverner will not yield all of its mystery, however scrupulously we analyze it. It is not simply that the music is technically complex, though it often is. Rather, it is the case that this repertory signals the kind of high mannerism possessed by a style in a stage of late decline, opaque and impenetrable. End quote. That was published in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association in 1991. A style in a stage of late decline, opaque and impenetrable. We're in 1991 here. We're not in the wood-paneled study of some cranky old Victorian critic, among the pipe smoke. This is a fairly recent reaction to the more complex side of Tudor sacred polyphony. According to this writer, it's the kind of high mannerism possessed by a style in a stage of late decline, opaque and impenetrable. Now that is actually incredibly useful to read, because sometimes we can learn a lot from people's complaints about music that they think is decadent or opaque or maybe both. And if we go back in time from the year 1991 to the early 16th century, the great Renaissance scholar Erasmus was one person who actually heard a lot of early Tudor singing. He heard it from what you could call the ethnographic perspective of a foreigner or a relative foreigner. Erasmus was not English at all. He was Dutch. But he spent a few years teaching in England. He heard a lot of their music, and he famously complained about their local high styles of music in more or less the same terms we just heard. The stuff is too elaborate, it's too obscure, it goes on much too long, and it's a waste of valuable resources that could be used elsewhere. Erasmus also famously complained about what we might call low style. He said that in England they indulge in something they call faubourden, which is a sort of degenerate, simple singing done by people who are too dense to learn the real art of music. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Then there is also a much less well-known passage from Erasmus, where he says that another problem with the English is they never actually sing what's in the books. They have this compulsion to improvise things and vary things and riff on things. To quote Erasmus directly, he says, quote, "There is a type of music among the English where many people sing together, but no one makes the sounds that the notes in the books show." And he brings that up in the context of verbal rhetoric. He's been talking about people who are incapable of just reading a text out loud without paraphrasing it somehow or making clever little comments on it. And of course, that's something that can be absolutely deadly in a liturgical context. He says that's how English musicians act with music. So here we have 3 different complaints from the same person who was actually there in England at the beginning of the 16th century. Complaint number 1, the music is too esoteric and overcomposed. Complaint number 2, it's too basic and dull. Complaint number 3, it takes too many improvisatory liberties with the existing materials. Now, what this tells us right away is that there was a vast amount of musical diversity right before the Reformation in England. It also tells us that our friend Erasmus was pretty much always grumpy about church music, but that's a different lecture. There was a whole continuum, you could call it, of low styles and high styles. There was a whole sound world with all kinds of practices and different levels of complexity. Now, of course, the biggest part of the sound world by far was chant. The majority of what any church singer of that generation was singing would have been chant. They called it plainsong in England. And musical establishments in Scotland before the Reformation tended to be a little bit more cosmopolitan and sophisticated. They called it cantus Gregorianus. But the English choirs never actually used that terminology. They just called it plainsong. Now, that was the absolute bedrock and the standard form of sung services right up to the late 1540s when the Book of Common Prayer came in, more or less overnight, made it all obsolete. So it's always worth remembering that every type of multi-voiced music existed in the context of chant, really like a fish exists in water. The music was sustained by chant on various levels. It gave it a space to move through. In fact, a big percentage of the actual body of the music consisted of chant, just like the fish with its water. Now, some of the chant they sang was very complex indeed. There's some very ornate melodies, and also singing something like matins on a feast day or for the office of the dead, which they did a lot, is a big commitment, musically speaking. We don't have time to even start looking into all that chant, but it's part of the whole sound world, along with all sorts of polyphonic techniques. And that's what happens when you have a healthy musical ecosystem, so to speak. It's complex, and it's diversified. So I'd like to take a dive now into that whole musical ecosystem. We'll start in the shallow end, so to speak, with some simpler and more direct styles. Then we can think about some higher and more complex styles. Then finally, we can step back a little and look at the whole continuum and some things we might be able to learn from it as musicologists and as performers. I remember talking a little about this topic in a seminar about a year ago, and the person organizing the seminar, who was a German scholar, incredibly orderly and rational, he switched my title around to high style and low style, with high style first. He just had to have his hierarchy in the right order. And of course, as the speaker, you just go with it. But I think low style really does come first. The more humble types of medieval and Renaissance polyphony were a huge part of the sound world at the time, even though we tend not to hear them very much in concerts and recordings nowadays, do we? That stuff gets crowded out by the more elaborate and more marketable repertoire. But if you go back to the real musical world, around the year 1500, it was always there. It was being sung in most churches on most days. And the most straightforward kind of low-style polyphony in England was fa-burden. People sang it everywhere. And that was the stuff that annoyed Erasmus because he didn't think it was real art music. Now, of course, many of you here will know fa-burden very well already, but I think it's worth taking 30 seconds or so to describe. Fa-burden is a method of three-part singing. You've got three voices, and the pre-existing chant melody is the middle voice. Then someone sings along with the chant a third below. Someone else sings along with it at the same time a fourth above, and the chant is in the middle of the sandwich. That gives you a nice string of first inversion chords, 6/3 chords, and it gives you a sound that's framed by parallel sixths. Then at each cadence, you resolve out to octaves. You snap to the grid of perfect consonances. And once you know how to do that, you might start adding little passing notes and various other adornments. But the basic idea is always a big, long string of parallel sixths with the chant in the middle of them. And what this is a way to get a nice, sweet, warm, continuous sound with minimum cognitive effort. Almost anyone can do it. You can teach kids to do it. They did. Now, Erasmus was entirely right about Faubourg in one sense. There were plenty of people who just didn't have the training or the ability or maybe even the intelligence to do any more than this simple harmonized music. Not everyone who sang in low styles also sang in high styles, but that was not true the other way around. Everyone who sang complex music also sang simple music. Even in really elite musical contexts, some of the polyphonic singing was fairly plain or low or improvised or semi-improvised. It was an important tool that everyone had in their toolkit. And we have a first-person account from an English musician of how this could work in real life. This is from a man named William Way, W-E-Y, who went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem with a group of other English people in the year 1462. William Way was precentor at Eton College, so a musician who worked in a very musical place. He kept a journal of his whole trip to Jerusalem and back. That was obviously a long trip in the 1460s, and his journal is a great piece of travel literature. At one point they're going through central Romania, they're going through Transylvania, and he says, there's this crazy guy in charge who's impaling everyone. I don't want him anywhere near us. And when he goes through Greece, he takes the time to write down a little Greek and English phrase book for pilgrims. Well, that stuff hasn't really changed much in 500 or 600 years. Kalimera, where's the tavern, and so on. But William Way wrote about pretty much everything, including the music that his group of English pilgrims sang at various holy sites. And it was mostly chant, not too surprisingly. Times, he specified that they sang a piece in Faubourg. These were all important pieces of music that they sang in the most special locations. When they first set foot in the Holy Land, they sang the hymn Urbs Beata Jerusalem in Faubourg. And we're going to hear more about that piece tomorrow. In fact, then we're going to sing it at Vespers on Thursday because it's that moment of the year. Then the English pilgrims went out into the hill country of Judea, where the Virgin Mary visited Elizabeth, and they sang the Magnificat in Faubourg. Then at Mount Calvary, at the place of the crucifixion, maybe you can even guess what they sang. They sang the hymn Vexilla Regis in Faubourg. So they were doing this to create extra beauty and extra solemnity at various points on their tour. It worked because Faubourg is such a physically portable thing. All you need is a usable copy of the chant, which can be in a little book or even in your memory. So this kind of singing is at one end of the range of portability. It's really the opposite of high-style music in a huge polyphonic choir book, which tends for practical reasons to stay in one place. William Way's own college had a book just like that just a few years later. That's the famous Eton Choirbook, which is not at all a portable item. It's just about the last thing you would want to carry with you on a pilgrimage. It's more than 2 feet high, it weighs 35, 40 pounds, and that huge manuscript of music was at home in one particular chapel, at one very particular set of geographical coordinates in England, on one lectern by one particular altar of the Virgin Mary to sing her Magnificat and her votive antiphon every evening. You're not going to be schlepping that giant choir book all the way through Central and Eastern Europe or carrying it around the hill country of Judea. On the other hand, you can do that with simpler types of music. These simpler types of music can be stational in the real liturgical sense of that word. You go to a place, you assemble there, and you sing there. And of course, for many of us here who do church music, that's what a lot of our life might look like. It's quite stational sometimes. We spend a lot of time going here and there on the road to different venues. We might be putting in some serious mileage. And the question is always, what can we do in a particular location with the particular singers we have there? Maybe just with a couple of voices. That's the same exact question that William Way was dealing with in the 1460s. And it turns out that one excellent answer to the question is, plain style, parallel sixths. Another very popular kind of lower style was what English musicians called descant. And broadly speaking, descant is a setup with two singers, where one person sings the pre-existing chant melody in equal notes or in some simple metrical arrangement, and then the other one sings a counter melody against the chant. And this takes a little bit more skill than fa burden because you have to make some choices in real time. Of course, you can do absolutely simple descant that's just note against note. That works. Although there was at least one singing group in England around 1500 that specified, if we're going to hire you, you have to be able to do descant with at least two notes against one. You have to get at least up to second species. And people who sang descant also had a real head start, because a lot of chant melodies come back again and again. And there are lots of melodic formulae in the Gregorian universe that are completely familiar. So people knew what would work as counter melodies with them, just like any decent jazz musician knows various things to do with various sets of chord changes. So descant in England was not something that was being invented from scratch every single time. What it offered was a whole spectrum of possibilities, depending on who was singing. It could be extremely humble. It could be what some people called cantus planus binatim, which you could translate as twofold plain chant, or it could get pretty virtuosic. And once again, we have some firsthand testimony from the late 15th century about how this worked in real life. This particular story is actually told by a young German musician, a young man named Johannes von Soest, who was working as a court singer in Northern Europe, again in the 1460s, when he met two English professional singers who were traveling from one court to another. They were basically between jobs. And he was absolutely stunned by their skill in descant and improvisation. And they told him, well, we need to go to Bruges now. We need to go work in Bruges, but if you want to come with us, we'll teach you how to do this. So Johannes von Soest would have been about 20 years old at the time. He dropped everything. He left behind his books. He tells us so. He left behind his nice clothes. He left behind his employer who wouldn't give him a year's sabbatical. And he went. He dropped everything and followed these two English singers to Bruges. And he says in retrospect that he'd never been so happy in his whole life. And again, we can see here that improvisation and music with just a couple of voices is something that's quite literally being taken on the road. In this case, it's in a little pod of two traveling singers from England who are exceptionally good at it, and the third person who runs away with them to learn it. Now, unfortunately, we don't have recordings of those performances for obvious technological reasons, but the closest thing we have to a snapshot of that kind of singing is in a wonderful English musical manuscript called the Ritson manuscript from that same generation. And it has a bunch of pieces for just two voices, where they take turns. It's a kind of dialogue. One of the voices sings the chant for a while, or paraphrases it, in fairly long notes, and the other voice creates these sort of ecstatic free melodies against it, and then they swap places, and the other person takes the cantus firmus for a while. So this is clearly something that comes out of a deep layer of improvisational practice, and then gets written down and reworked and polished and preserved for us in manuscript form. And once you start looking for this sort of substrate, this deep substrate of improvisational practice in English music, you can see it in all kinds of places. In a lot of small-scale polyphonic works, and even in some really big pieces, you see these frameworks of descant. You see these frameworks of fa burden. You get the sense that these were common languages that were spoken by composers. And in a way, it was a native language because you learned these techniques as a child, really before you even learned to read complex polyphony, much less compose it yourself. And the music theorist Thomas Morley could still say in the late 1590s, so almost two whole generations after the Reformation, he could still say that within living memory, the majority of the music that was being sung in churches in England was various kinds of improvisation and elaboration on chant. So within living memory, for Morley, that would have been writing in the late 1590s, about 50 or 60 years earlier. And he writes about these techniques, and he jokes at one point that maybe they'll come back into fashion someday, like old styles of clothing. But what he was really doing was preserving this whole body of unwritten tradition that he knew was in danger of being lost once it went out of living memory. So we've been exploring some simpler types of music and ways of improvising, and what we might call plain styles. Now I'd like to spend just a little time thinking about high-style music. In many ways, the more formal and elaborate stuff is much more familiar to people nowadays. Let's imagine a big motet. I'm sure many of you have a favorite, for 5 or 6 voices, maybe 10 minutes long, maybe even longer than that. This is one of those splendid pieces by Taverner or Shepherd, maybe, that our correspondent from 1991 thinks is just heading off the edge into decadence and decline. Now, that piece of music, we probably know it because it can still be commodified or marketed in the modern world. It can still be sold for dollars or pounds or euros, whatever your currency is. It can be the big opening track on an album. It can be the big closing number in a professional concert. If the performance is really good, it'll get 500,000 hits on YouTube. There may not be room for this huge polyphonic piece in a lot of churches right now, but it's something that turns out to be compatible with the modern commodification of early music. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, the revival of high-style Renaissance polyphony has really been one of the wonders of the 20th and 21st centuries. So many of us are right here in this room because of that. It's become an important part of our lives. It was an important part of life for a lot of people in Tudor England as well. And the main example I want to use right now was maybe the quintessential genre of big formal music in their world. And those are the big motets, usually motets in honor of the Virgin Mary, that generally get called votive antiphons nowadays. And you sang one of them as a separate devotion at the very end of the day. After Vespers and Compline and everything else was done, people at the time in England called it the antiphon or the anthem, which is the English cognate of antiphon, or working musicians sometimes just called it the salve. Now, quite often these big motets were quite literally settings of the Salve Regina, usually with lots of tropes because that's how they did it in England. But the motet at the end of the day was also generically known as the salve, and it was sung as part of its own little service, the salve service, that was quite separate from the hours of the official sung office. In fact, the official liturgical books don't even mention the salve service. These votive antiphons were a type of music that really existed in their own sphere. And people, especially in cities, not just in England, but all around Europe, they went to church to hear the salve service at the end of the working day. The service is, to use the technical term, in the form of a commemoration. The antiphon at the commemoration is a really impressive large work of polyphony, and everything else is focused in around it. And the salve service is not a very big event. It's maybe 15, 20 minutes long, and it can be extremely beautiful. It was really something by lay people and for lay people in many ways, certainly in England. It belonged to the donors who gave money to support these evening devotions. It belonged to the guilds, the brotherhoods and sisterhoods in these English cities that were huge centers of popular piety, especially to Our Lady. And this music also belonged in a special way to the people who were professional musicians, who made a living by singing in church. In fact, sometimes the salve service existed in a totally different economic sphere than the other services that were going on. One of the parishes in London that I've been studying, the parish of St. Magnus the Martyr, a big church down by the river, they had separate funding for the salve service with a big polyphonic motet every night. And the funding came from a group of lay people who were called the Masters of the Salve. They were a brotherhood devoted to the Virgin Mary, and they sponsored this group of high-end professional singers that did this complex polyphony. And there's a wonderful document that I found that records some arguing that was going on in the parish right around the year 1500, where people were asking why these singers couldn't also be at matins and mass in the morning. In fact, people were reporting that some of these singers had been seen fishing when they could have been helping with the plain song at matins. Of course, that's the absolutely prime time for fishing, that hour right before sunrise. And the parish was right by the river, so it's no great surprise that they were out there catching fish instead of singing matins. But what this tells us is that even in an absolutely thriving and absolutely intact liturgical world, you still have some tension between the official canonical services done under obligation by the clergy, and on the other hand, these extra things, these almost gratuitous things that can be extremely musically elaborate. Or as we can read in the directions for the Salve service in one college chapel, sung in the very best way they know. This was from Eton College Chapel. This is where William Way was singing when he wasn't hiking around the Balkans singing in Faubourn. Sung in the very best way they know. In other words, put together by skilled composers, written with these rich textures and wide ranges, and all kinds of virtuosic musical figuration, copied by hand into these books that were very specialized and very expensive. All of this in the best way they know. These long and elaborate high-style pieces were also opportunities to think about time in a slightly different way, to experience time in a slightly different manner. By the beginning of the 16th century, you had lots of mechanical clocks in England. Clocks had become part of daily life. You had these machines that chimed and rang bells and measured and divided time into little regulated parcels. Now, of course, that's incredibly useful to have, not least if you're trying to keep the whole daily round of liturgy in some kind of order. And something like the votive antiphon at the end of the day existed a bit outside of that regulated sphere. Everything just stopped for a while, and you had pages of sheer beautiful sound and extremely long melismas and virtuosic figuration and all the rest. There were also some sections of big polyphonic mass settings in England that had a similar effect. That's something composers did sometimes at the Sanctus or at the final Agnus. They just stepped outside of time a little bit and let the sonority and the figuration take over. It's a very concentrated musical experience. It can be a bit unruly, in the quite literal sense of the word. It's no surprise that it made Erasmus a bit antsy to hear the extremes of English ornate style for full choir. He used various metaphors to talk about it, but it generally boiled down to one of two things. Either it's dissolute or it's irrational. Well, yes, it is. There's a wonderful story in a 16th century English book. This is a collection of Tudor jokes and funny stories, sort of merry tales. And there's one story about an old farmer from the deep countryside who goes to London for the first time in his life. And he ends up in St. Paul's Cathedral while the choir is singing. And he starts saying out loud, "I must be in heaven now. Am I dead now? No, I can't be dead. I have to get some things sorted out on the farm before I die." And so on. Now, of course, people told this story so they could laugh at the naive old farmer. But I think he was right in a way. This type of music, at its very best, can just take us slightly out of time. And it's no surprise that some people felt slightly threatened by it on some level. It's very, very powerful stuff. There's always a bit more to say about both high style and low style in England, but that's a start. And for now, I'd like to finish up with just a few practical reflections for us as performers and as musicologists. And first of all, for those of us who perform early music, especially in the live context of church services, one thing I might say is that we shouldn't necessarily be afraid to explore the far ends of the continuum, to really start pushing them sometimes. There's a place for very low-style music that has complete integrity and dignity. Plain style is not the garbage heap. It doesn't mean tasteless, it doesn't mean silly. Plain style is a positive designation. It can fit into just about any situation, any group of musicians. It's portable, it's memorizable, it's always adaptable. And it works for every kind of singer, from little school children to hard-boiled professionals, who are going to sound stunningly beautiful when they're just singing in parallel thirds or tenths. Something like parallel tenths has real dignity. That's pretty much the scaffolding for Byrd's whole three-part Mass, among many other works. And it's also a framework that a lot of Renaissance organists used for improvisation. When Byrd wanted to illustrate organ playing in one of his motets, where there's a whole line in the text about the organ resounding, that's exactly how he did it. Just those simple, simple parallel tenths with a free inner part. In fact, if you want to create some simple and beautiful music in a way that has direct continuity with the whole polyphonic tradition, a great place to start is just to write yourself some parallel tenths and start playing with the free middle voice in between them. That is really the plain style of the late Renaissance. It worked for Byrd, it worked for Victoria and Palestrina, it'll work for you. Or another thing you could explore is how to improvise simple canons in just two parts, or build simple imitation in just two voices, just two people. There's a great series of YouTube videos where the music theorist Peter Schubert teaches that in real time with various students. And you can see how the students smile. They just grin when they get to the cadence and they stick that landing like a gymnast, getting a perfect 10. Plain style can be incredibly satisfying when it's done well. And I think there's also a lot of exploring to be done at the other end of the continuum. The Salve service, in particular, is something that might be worth investigating a little bit more for performers, especially for people in city churches who have access to good professional singers. That was what urban lay people did at the end of the day to unwind after they got off work. They went to hear the Salve. It's a short and straightforward service, very unthreatening, and it would be a perfect context for the big freestanding pieces of Renaissance music that just don't quite fit in at Mass or even at Vespers. Those huge motets are not at all opaque or impenetrable. They're just very much dependent on context. This continuum of styles, as I've called it, can also be a useful tool for us as musicologists. Among other things, it's one way of thinking about what really happened at the Reformation in England. All of a sudden, composers were being restricted to maybe a third of the continuum, maybe 2/5 at most, because high style was totally unacceptable now. The styles in the middle were kind of suspect, which is unfortunate because English composers in the first part of the 16th century had really started to explore all this middle territory. And what almost everyone wanted were various elements of low style, of humble style. Now that was good news in a way because it meant that composers didn't have to start from scratch. They already had ways of doing things that they could adapt to a new language and to a new way of thinking about liturgical music in general. The whole idea of high, middle, and low style goes right back to the ancient classics, of course. And if you look at what Cicero has to say about low style, for him, it's certainly not a scrap heap or something undignified. It has a particular purpose, and I'm mentioning Cicero now because for him, plain style is essentially didactic. Low style is perfect for teaching people. And one very strong idea that you see in the English Reformation is the idea that maybe the most basic task of sacred music is to teach something to people. It's a means to an end. It's supposed to be didactic. In fact, the Reformers generally agreed that liturgy itself is supposed to be something didactic in a way. It's there to teach us, to exhort us, to make us better, to edify us, if you want to use a good old-fashioned word. And as soon as that becomes a primary goal, there's not much room left for the whole ethos of high-style polyphonic motets and masses. That sort of music doesn't teach anyone anything, at least not directly. It just is. You're just taking all this time, all this energy, and you're using it up in this beautifully gratuitous way. You are squandering it for the divine. That was a totally normal way of doing the creative arts in England, and then all of a sudden, almost overnight, it wasn't. And that was a much more drastic change than just saying, oh, we need to sing in English now, or even saying we need to get rid of all the melismas. It's a bit more existential. Now, there were some cases where composers went right down the continuum to a very plain style and were still very successful with it. Thomas Tallis was probably one of the most successful ones. Think of a little piece like Tallis's famous anthem, "If Ye Love Me, Keep My Commandments," which may well be the earliest surviving piece of English Reformation polyphony, judging from really both external and internal evidence. And it's a perfect little piece. It had all of those generations of plain style right there behind it. All the things we just talked about, simple sonorities with these imperfect intervals, simple chords, simple dialogue between pairs of voices. And it works. And I think this also tells us something about Tallis himself and the way he as a composer interacted with these extreme historical events that were taking place around him. He reacted to this huge disruption by using the whole range of musical resources he had and creating something as beautiful as he could. In fact, in some ways, the whole story of 16th century music in Europe as it unfolds is just watching how people used their resources in the face of sometimes extreme disruption. And that's also one of the things I admire most about Bill. He's a model of how to thrive as a musician in whatever circumstances might come around. So it's a real privilege to be here thinking about this music in honor of you, Bill. And I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone about your research during the next couple of days, and of course, singing some more with you. Thank you all so much. No, I don't want to hold you up from your reception, but...
We will be early if we don't have questions, and there might not be food yet, so we will heartily entertain questions.
And speaking of receptions, to my Stanford colleagues, those of you who are here, and also I know some of you from Stanford are listening on the live stream, it's such a treat to be giving one of the Alexander lectures. I remember when I was a grad student here in the late 90s, one of my jobs was to cut up the cheese and crackers for the receptions, you know, make the coffee. I think I ordered orange chicken for Joseph Kerman, you know, but it's such an honor to be here speaking in this series. And thank you, Stanford Music Department, for all you've given me. Mm-hmm.
Kind of reminds me of something that I learned later in French music that they call salut.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't sort of Marian. It was exposing the host. Mm-hmm. But it was also this kind of short thing that almost was I don't know if it was a replacement for some other kind of singing, but it was really common to have a salut service.
Yeah.
Which is a really brief kind of thing. I don't know if there's any kind of connection or if there's a history of a similar thing also.
Absolutely. This was something pan-European. In fact, the French called it salut, the English called it the salve, the Dutch in the Low Countries called it the lof, the same as the German word lob, meaning praise. And very often these services would come to include benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. They would expose the sacrament and have that as an additional devotion. And it was, because it was such a porous kind of form, yes, absolutely, that the salut in French-speaking countries is certainly the sibling of what was being sung in England. And that's a wonderful thing about the liturgical form of the commemoration, isn't it? It's very much ad libitum. You know, you say, I'd like to commemorate this particular local saint. You have a commemoration for him or for her. I'd like to sing a commemoration for peace. You sing Da Pacem and you have the versical response collect. You can build this thing by yourself. It has lots of flexibility. And in fact, some people have argued that the whole benediction service originally came out of these evening devotions. If that's important to the community, you can stick that on. So yeah, the French, in fact, I think the French got there first. Since in 15th century England, everything French was, well, when they weren't having battles and killing each other, everything French was desperately fashionable. And I think a lot of this was taken over, in fact, from the salut there across the water. So thank you. That's a very good point.
So you mentioned that there were two styles, the Hamlet and the continuum. Is there a middle style?
Absolutely. The question was, I've been talking at great length about high styles and low styles, and the question is there anything in the middle? Absolutely. It's a continuum. You know, and because fortunately for you, don't have 3 hours to talk, I only have 1, I focused a little bit on these far ends. But there were all kinds of what you could call middle styles, you know, with a sort of guarded elaboration. And that is something that composers in England really started exploring more as you got into the 16th century, especially when they picked up some techniques like imitation. There were English composers who obviously knew Josquin, obviously knew these techniques of sort of nesting together all of these entries between parts. And that's a wonderful sort of method of building these pieces that they're not just series of chords because they have free contrapuntal parts. They're not just spinning out these ecstatic melodies that sort of go where you want them to go. They're structural methods, and that's what composers of masses and motets were really, really starting to explore. And again, these ideas of, you know, you compose a motet and then you base a mass on that material, sort of using it as raw material. That's something that Tallis did, you know, extremely European of him. He wrote a piece, he wrote a parody mass on it, and then of course 5 minutes later the king said, nope, can't have that anymore. So just that sort of development in England got very much frustrated in a way. But on the continent, composers in other countries where you could still pursue the mass, for example, as a genre, you have many, many wonderful masses by Palestrina, for example, that are really quintessential middle style. You know, something like the Missa Brevis, something like the Aeterna Christi Munera. Just right. You know, the porridge isn't too hot, it isn't too cold. No extremes. I'm sure Erasmus would have loved it. And there's also a kind of decorum in middle style, isn't there? There's really a time and a place for that. And if history had gone differently, English composers, I think, would have spent more time in that territory. But yeah, great question.
Hi, Kerry. Thank you for your talk.
Oh, you're so welcome.
I'm curious. You mentioned that benediction may have been appended to these commemoration services. I'm wondering if you think that might be the potential context for what English musicologists have called elevation motets that don't seem to have been actually sung, or if you would think that an elevation motet would have been sung in actually mass. And they're among other materials that possibly could have been for these commemorative services. Do you think that might be the potential context?
Well, people argue back and forth about where elevation motets fit in. We're using one, if I'm not mistaken, as a communion at the Mass tomorrow. The Pierre de la Rue, O Salutaris, is in the manuscripts as a sort of elevation piece. Doesn't it come, is it in, Bill, is it in place of the? It's in the Mass, yeah. So I think those are very much liturgical pieces. And the elevation is rather a physical term, you know, is elevating the host. But I think you're right that it does fit well into this kind of extra liturgical context. And a lot of these pieces, again, were in plain style, they were portable. When we sing the communion motet tomorrow, the O Salutaris by Pierre de la Rue, listen for the parallel tenths and long notes. They're right there. They're always there.
I'm wondering what, if Erasmus came to Italy, what he would put a cantus planus finale there, because it was a very lively tradition and many scholarly conferences about it. But my question was, like 60 years ago, there was this big thing about singing by sights. So in order to create the pop version, you didn't just say, here, you sing this, third low and fourth low, let's go. It was, you look at this note, and then you sing something else with some other note, and you sing something else. And being a pragmatist at the time, anyway, I thought, why five? It's so complicated to get parallel sixth thirds. So it seems like a complicated process to get a very simple effect in those styles.
Yep. Yeah, this whole process of citing, where instead of just saying, oh, you sing a third, you think of it a certain way and you transpose mentally. I think part of the reason for that, why the English sometimes had these complicated ways of explaining it, as you mentioned, is because a lot of it was being sung fully from memory. You weren't even looking at a chant book and thinking with your eyes, oh, third down, fourth up. The whole process was going on in the memory. And of course, you've got two layers going on there, because if I'm singing the top part of the fa burden, I have to have recall of the chant, how that melody behaves, and of how my part interacts with that thing that's also in my memory. And a lot of those instructions for citing and so forth, they make a lot more sense if you just memorize the instructions, close the chant book, put it back on the shelf, stare out the window, and sing from memory. Were people angry at the Reformation for having their music restricted? I'm writing a big book about singers and what their experiences were like during these years. That's a big question that I'm asking myself. It can be hard to get a good answer, because if somebody got angry in public, they could get in very, very big trouble. You know, Henry VIII was happy to decapitate you for the slightest, you know. It was interesting. When I study these groups of musicians as they go through these drastic changes, you don't see as much turnover in these professional groups, professional choirs, professional ensembles as you might expect. I think when there were some of these extreme disruptions, people tended to stay with their community most often. You know, even if they were being told to do some outrageous things, if life was getting difficult, they stuck with their community. They stayed in one place, they stayed with their colleagues. And you have this kind of amazing continuity. The one difficult part in England, of course, was people started asking them to swear these oaths and sort of renounce the Catholic religion. And at that point, some people just started emigrating. They'd go to other countries where they could practice freely. But the continuity is really surprising, and I think these musical communities were strong enough that they held people. Oh. Yes, the question here is part of that, because they still got to sing for each other. And in fact, one thing that you see right at the time of the Reformation in England is all of these big public votive antiphons and motets disappear. But the motet becomes chamber music. It comes inside. It moves into the chamber, it moves into the private household. And as you say, you have some of these same groups of people who keep making music for themselves. And the great motets of William Byrd, you know, some of them with very Catholic texts that would have been quite illegal to sing in church, those were conceived as chamber music. And the people that would have been singing the Salve in front of Our Lady's altar 50 years before, instead they were sitting around the dinner table. But that thread of continuity was there, and what was intact was the community. You just take it inside and draw the curtains. Any? Well, I would say, judging from the accent, I think we have an expert on that here. I'll turn this over to you. Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't seem like the English are part of that game to a certain extent. So I wonder, why does England seem to have its own distinct culture, which seems more inward-looking than the American culture is? And I wonder, this might be a sort of question, might not be, you can tell me. Is England a pioneer in having professional musicians who are not clergy to sing?
So 2 questions. One, what makes England special, musically speaking? And the other one is, was England pioneering in having musicians who weren't clergy, who were specifically lay cantors? Now, the first question, obviously, is England special? That could be a special issue of some journal somewhere just dealing with that. What's interesting is the difference in Renaissance England between church music and secular music. When you look at instrumentalists, they were an international bunch. You had string players, you had brass players. They were coming from France, from Italy, from Spain, all kinds of different communities. But the singers were all local. You know, you have a couple people with vaguely Flemish-sounding names, but it was very much an in-house industry, you know, which is, I think some of this obviously has to do with these local techniques of improvising, which this very experienced German musician had never heard before, the story that we heard earlier, and thought was wonderful. But it wasn't as internationalized as instrumental music, as secular court music, for example. I mean, you look at the list of Henry VIII's instrumentalists, and they look like the EU, you know, like the United Nations. And then the English people all have these very English names. And as far as musicians not being clergy, absolutely, I think that's something that was already quite solidly the case in England by the late 15th century. Now, on the continent, in the rest of Europe, the earliest major composer I can think of who was just a married layman, Heinrich Isaac. Anyone know anyone earlier? Please tell me at the reception. But this idea of a sort of division of labor was something extremely English. You have the clergy who do the clergy stuff, and you have the lay singers who basically have the attention to pay, the time, the sort of cognitive reservoir to do this extremely elaborate polyphonic stuff. And you have a division of labor in the services that are sung. This goes back to our professional singers at St. Magnus the Martyr, who their job is to sing the Lady Mass and the Salve service, and people complain because they're not helping chant at Vespers and High Mass, or at Matins, and High Mass. Because there was that division of labor, which in some ways, of course, is deeply artificial, but it's also deeply pragmatic. It works very well with the realities of, I would say, both the clerical and the musical world, and it enables you to have this class of musicians that produce absolutely exquisite music. So, yeah, it's a big set of questions, but I'll be considering those as I go on writing about this. Thank you.